Hi, friends. Before we get into the show, we wanted to ask that you rate, review, and subscribe to The Breakout. It's quick, it's super easy, and it's a really important way to help people find us and get to hear these inspirational stories. We really appreciate it.
I had a very promising budding career as an attorney right after I graduated. I was making more money than I knew how to spend. I was living on the Upper East Side. Everything looked promising.
On paper, it seemed like Justin Maffett had achieved the life he'd always wanted. But instead of feeling happy, he felt trapped in a career that was making him miserable. Then, in 2020, COVID lockdowns forced Justin into a state of physical and emotional isolation. And that simmering resentment he felt towards his work turned into a mental health crisis that would upend his entire life.
Not only was I hospitalized 3 times for a total of 30 days, involuntarily hospitalized, but I was also involuntarily medicated. I was forcibly restrained. I was walked through the hospital in leg chains and handcuffs.
These horrible episodes led Justin to a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, the first step on his road to recovery. Now, his story has been committed to print in Patrick Kennedy and Stephen Fried's book, Profiles in Mental Health Courage. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, so today, Justin joins us to talk about his long journey back from the brink. He shares how it altered his perspective on life and why he hopes that sharing his story will boost awareness and reduce the stigma around mental illness.
This episode is about Justin's incredible resilience in the face of intense trauma and how he embraced radical transparency as a powerful way forward. Welcome to The Breakout, a show about smashing through life's little boxes and forging your own path. I'm Dr. Carrie Ulrich.
And I'm Kelly Gunther. Carrie and I are people and change experts, best friends, and business partners. We've spent more than 25 years helping employees and leaders change. With love and a lot of laughs, we're here to empower you to live life on your terms. Our methods may seem a bit unconventional, but trust us, they will change your life.
Let's be real for a second. We know change can sometimes be scary. Heck, it even scares us. But staying the same can be even scarier. On The Breakout, we prove that you can escape expectations. And best of all, we show you how. All right, Justin, again, we're so excited you're here. So with your story, you've confronted some hard truths. What would you say you broke away from?
I would say I broke away from fear, anxiety, and shame. I guess having graduated from some prestigious universities and from having different experiences, internships experience, and job experience, there was a lot of pressure that I felt to be a high achiever and keep that going. And then after my mental health crisis, there was a lot of anxiety about getting back on that path and living up to all of that potential and making people proud. And so I found myself making choices more out of a sense of obligation rather than a sense of, this is what I really would like to do. And then being told that you have bipolar disorder is not easy. There's a lot of stigma around it, particularly with my case and situation. There was a court case involved and other people's lives were affected and impacted because of my behavior. And so while I was wrestling with the stigma of the diagnosis like anybody else, I also had a lot of literal guilt and shame because of my behavior while in the throes of these manic psychotic episodes. It took a lot of self-love and grace to forgive myself and to achieve a sense of peace and serenity, and knowing that with this diagnosis, it wasn't me who consciously did these things, did these acts, hurt these people. And, in some ways, I am kind of also a victim of my own body, which is a really difficult thing to grapple with because these things kind of happen to you. You wake up and you're told, like, you did this, and that can be very frustrating and unsettling.
Well, Justin, first of all, thank you. And we're honored that you're going to share your story with us because it's quite a story and you're very vulnerable to tell us all that and share it. So take us back because, 2020 was the year that a lot of things changed for you. So what did things look like before 2020?
Things are good. I was a student at Dartmouth and I had a really successful undergraduate experience and I graduated with honors. I had interned on Capitol Hill, the ACLU, and the White House. I had friends. I traveled. I studied abroad. And then I went to Columbia for law school, and that was also a pretty smooth experience. There was in between undergrad and law school, a very difficult summer. That was when I was a White House intern. And so I was there during the Alton Sterling and Philando Castile BLM shootings, and also the Orlando Pulse massacre. And so I was working in the White House communications office. I went into Columbia kind of depressed, and that depression kind of lingered around for those 3 years. So I would say Columbia was not as smooth sailing as undergrad, but I had a very promising budding career as an attorney right after I graduated. I was making more money than I knew how to spend. I was living on the Upper East Side. Everything looked promising for the most part.
So what happened to change your life and your trajectory in 2020? Tell us about that.
I was not particularly happy in my job. I was a corporate lawyer at a major international law firm. And while sure, you are well compensated, there's a reason for that. And it's because it's not necessarily the most enjoyable job. So there was a lot of frustration that I was experiencing, a lot of doubt, the beginnings of what would be anger and resentment for having made the choice to work at a firm versus work in media like at MSNBC or NBC News like I had previously interned at. And so there were a number of kind of feelings that I had that had been simmering, that had been brewing for a while. And then I think BLM and the pandemic brought it all to a boil because I was increasingly isolated. I was living by myself in a studio apartment in Manhattan, and we had the kind of lockdown. I felt both physically trapped in my apartment because of COVID, but also mentally trapped because here we are in a global pandemic and BLM's going on and I'm having to work from home in a job that I don't like. So it just became too much. And eventually that was unbearable and I cracked.
What was that crack, Justin?
So it was difficult to really see that I was struggling. You could tell that I was not enjoying my job and I was starting to have more interpersonal conflict with my bosses. But, some people aren't great employees. Some people are unhappy in their job. So it's not immediately clear that this person is experiencing mania or psychosis.
Right.
At least in my case, it wasn't like one day I was fine and the next day I was having a full-blown episode. It's kind of like boiling a frog. As it continues to heat up, the frog doesn't get out because it's acclimated to this new heat, and then eventually it's boiled. And so I couldn't really tell how unstable I was becoming because it was progressing over the course of many months. But eventually it did come to a boil, and I had keyed my boss's car. I had sent a slew of really aggressive and threatening emails to that boss, along with my other mentors at the firm, breaking a number of laws along the way. And I was eventually involuntarily hospitalized. So that was really the breaking point. And mind you, this was Christmas Day of 2020. So I spent Christmas Day in a jail cell that night, I guess, and then was hospitalized. And then skipping ahead a little bit, when I was released, I was arrested in the lobby of the hospital in front of my mom. And I spent New Year's Eve in jail too. So 2 holidays missed, spent with the NYPD. So that was a wake-up call.
I've had friends diagnosed with bipolar. We have a family member who's passed, who is bipolar. So I have been more aware of it because of personal interactions. And it is tough. It's tough to talk to people when they're in mania, tough to talk to them when they're depressed. So what I appreciate about Justin is the vulnerability, the sharing of the story, the destigmatizing it.
To be, in your 20s and to have to go through something that most or many may not ever go through. 2 arrests, multiple felony counts. That is a lot for anyone to go through in their life. And then to come out the other side with continued work and effort, to be able to speak with such clarity, such vulnerability, and such candor is something that I think is just absolutely incredible.
Justin, at this point, were you diagnosed with bipolar? Were you figuring out, oh my God, something's very wrong, right? It's not just, I just don't like my job.
It would take 3 hospitalizations before I would be diagnosed. And that's not necessarily a fault of the system. I do have complaints about the system. We can get to that. But the reason why I wasn't initially diagnosed is because bipolar is sometimes difficult to diagnose.
Yes.
It can be misdiagnosed, and there's a danger to misdiagnosing because of all the stigma around it. So the psychiatrists at the first hospital, Bellevue in Manhattan, told me that they were reluctant to diagnose me bipolar after just 1 manic episode. They wanted to see if it reoccurred. So they just diagnosed me with having a manic-like event. And then the second doctor pretty much did the same thing. And then interestingly enough, the third hospitalization, I technically diagnosed myself because by this point I had seen enough of my own behavior. And from December to February, I was hospitalized 3 times and spent 30 nights inpatient. So I asked the doctors, do you think I'm bipolar? I believe I'm bipolar or have bipolar disorder. And they agreed and we went forward.
So did you see signs when you look back, or did it really come out of more of the blue for you?
I would say I had high functioning depression, no different than I have high functioning bipolar disorder, which made it more difficult for people to really pick up on things until it was too late.
Yeah.
It's not that I should have picked up on certain mental health issues. It's that I should have picked up on this festering frustration and resentment for being in spaces where I felt like I wanted to be someplace else. And what I mean by that is I was in class and there were a lot of big social problems going on in the outside world. Trump had just been elected my 1L year. And so there were a lot of things dealing with immigration, dealing with trans rights. And here I am wanting to go to law school to be able to have a voice in all these discussions, but I'm studying train accidents from the 1800s. And so there was a kind of brewing resentment of this system of law school. And then I didn't realize that that system is even more acutely felt for me in corporate law, in terms of how regimented it is, in terms of how corporate it is. So I didn't realize that that feeling of being trapped in the classroom, which was also a feeling that I had felt at the White House, feeling trapped behind my desk when it felt like all these horrible things are going on in the outside world and I wanted to be a part of that. I should have listened to that inner feeling of feeling trapped and understanding what would happen if I continue to feel this way for too long, because that anger from being trapped is what blew up when I was manic and psychotic at the law firm. So if I had chosen sooner, made the more authentic choice and chosen me sooner, I wouldn't have blown up later, I think.
I think so many people have that, Justin, regardless if they have a bipolar disorder or any other mental illness, they feel still trapped. And I think that's why your story resonates.
Yeah, and I think if you continue to choose against yourself for too long, it's like you're withdrawing from yourself. And even though I can recognize that I wish I had known that, I was also 22 and now I'm 31. At least I was 22 when I was in law school, and I was 27 when I was hospitalized. And so I'm obviously not going to necessarily have the same insight at 27 and 22 as 31, having also gone through all of these things and come out of it.
We'll get back to the interview after this quick break.
On the Breakout, Carrie and I celebrate big changes and small shifts. Only about 10% of us are really self-aware, but 90% of us think we are. Without self-awareness, change is tough. And if you don't know what box you're in, you can't break out of it. That's where we come in.
We are coaches and consultants that help you dig into change. We've spent our lives breaking through expectations, and we've devoted our careers to showing people how to do the same. We're here to help you demolish the story you've built around yourself to reveal the true you. Then the real fun begins.
And by fun, we mean helping you figure out your why and taking action to forge a fresh path. Connect with us at abrachigroup.com.
Oh my goodness, to go through all this and then to come out of it and be so genuine and authentic and know yourself so well at 31 is amazing, just amazing.
Absolutely. And your experience is one that's really compelling, and the examples that you give are so tangible. So I wonder, Justin, were people in your life recognizing these things happening with you and calling them out along with you to help recognize that there was something that wasn't quite right? Or what did those relationships look like?
Well, I had some friends that would call out certain comments that I would make that they found odd, but they weren't necessarily pointing towards mental health. You know, given my personality, sometimes I can just be sarcastic or kind of exuberant or over the top. So, for example, I was walking with a friend of mine in San Francisco and we ran into Ezra Klein. We walked past him and I phrased it as, oh, wow, that could have been interesting. Ezra could have met me versus we could have met him because he's obviously the bigger celebrity. And so my friend pointed it out and also then acknowledged that I had made a series of statements over the course of hanging out with him that if you were to pathologize it, it would be a sense of grandeur and grandiosity and elevated sense of self. But then there were more clear signs, like spontaneously, actually on that trip, I spontaneously ordered a Tesla on my computer and I moved apartments into a higher floor apartment in a nicer building. And extravagant spending is a hallmark sign of mania. I was increasingly isolating myself from my family. I was increasingly hostile to my mom, to my coworkers, and I was, in terms of my irritability, it was off the charts. And so people were starting to pick up on this. But one of the issues with bipolar and other mental health conditions is, for some of them, if you try to confront the person about it, it backfires because they become very hostile and defensive. And dealing with a manic person, you're not reasoning with someone who can necessarily be fully reasoned with. So even though I had family that tried to help, I wasn't in a position to be helped, except for one person who was my godfather, Dr. Arthur Evans, who is the current CEO of the American Psychological Association, APA, and he was then too. He was a natural confidant for me, and he also assisted me through a lot of this saga. He helped me get into inpatient facilities. It's also a very difficult and confusing system to navigate, especially when you're currently going through crisis. So you really do need to have an advocate or someone else who can handle that for you. And so he's someone who kind of broke through the mud of getting me help. And then, of course, my mom had to deal with a bunch of stuff that I had put her through, but she came to my hospital room every day, walking through snow for a mile from my apartment to visit me. So, and then she helped me in my recovery. I had to move back to my parents' house and live there for a year as I recovered.
What I heard from that was you can fight the internal battle, but somehow it always comes out.
Yes.
So when you're not able to find a way to creatively or otherwise truly live a life that's fulfilling for you, it can backfire in other ways.
Yeah, I think, Kelly, so your body and your mind know that there's a giant misalignment, and eventually you somehow kind of have to pay for it, right? And I think whether you have a diagnosed mental illness like Justin, I think so many of us can understand that misalignment in a small sense or to a very large extent, like he had it. But most of us can understand, like, oh, it doesn't feel right now. Why do I do it? I think that's this beautiful message that even if you don't have a mental health diagnosis, you can understand Justin's articulation of this kind of not having enough in the bank and bankrupting yourself.
Justin shared his story in a short film called The Wildest Pearl and in the book Profiles of Mental Health Courage, released in 2024. Carrie and I wanted to know how those projects and coming to terms with his experiences have reshaped his perspective.
So it's something that I'm still processing in many ways. Working on the book was an amazing opportunity, not just to be able to play a larger role in this discussion, in this field, on the front lines of advocacy. So it was also a means of processing what happened. Sometimes I forget everything that happened. Not only was I hospitalized 3 times for a total of 30 days, involuntarily hospitalized, but I was also involuntarily medicated. I was forcibly restrained. I was walked through the hospital in leg chains and handcuffs. And those experiences, I guess I had somewhat compartmentalized. And going through the book, I had to discuss it in great detail and the timeline. And so that was cathartic in its own way. But the honest truth is, I thought it was over in terms of, I did the book, did some speaking engagements. Yay, I'm on the other side. But then I realized that I have certain triggers now from my experience being in the hospital. There were times in the hospital where the nurse, she didn't believe I was a lawyer. I was talking about being a lawyer, and she was like, "You're not really a lawyer. You just think you are. You're sick. You're in the hospital." And that really screws with your brain. That kind of helplessness, the lack of credibility and autonomy, being forcibly restrained and then being drugged with sedatives and then waking up in restraints, that kind of fear and lack of autonomy again. And so afterwards, I had traveled for a year and a half. I had only worked for a few months. And then I moved to France and started a PhD program. And so I thought, everything was great. But in the past few weeks alone, actually, since October, I'm starting to realize certain triggers that lead me to have outbursts of anger. And it's basically PTSD. I say basically because I'm actually going through the process of the diagnosis right now, and so I don't want to get ahead of it. But there's still lingering kind of memories in my body. Like if someone grabs my arm and it reminds me of being restrained, or if someone doesn't believe at face value what I'm saying and it reminds me of that nurse, I just go into a different headspace and I have this outburst, and it's happened twice in the past few weeks. And I realize maybe I'm only realizing it now because I was only doing kind of fun things for a few years after this because I needed to decompress. And now I'm being put more into a professional setting where I'm being asked to do things I don't want to do. And I'm starting to feeling more closed in than I was before. And that's what I meant by what are the warning signs and listening to yourself. Because if you read the book and if you listen to what I say about my experience, it's basically a near-death experience. Because so many things, even things that aren't in the book, could have gone worse. I put myself in very dangerous situations. I put other people in dangerous situations. I nearly lost my freedom because I had been arrested and charged with so many felonies, but eventually they were all dropped because reasons of mental health. And of course, I lost my job, I lost my apartment, I lost friends and mentors. And so how that changed my outlook is, we hear more stories about people beating cancer or surviving near-death experiences, but not so much as to what it feels like to be on the other side of what I just went through. But it's a similar story that you might hear of reassessing your entire life, like what really matters and why. And I realized that I couldn't take time for granted. I can't take my health for granted, and I can't take my relationships for granted. So I live more in the present than I did before. I used to always live in the future, and that was a product of my ambition. And I don't think through the lens of career per se. I think through the lens of how I want to contribute and what kind of role I want to play in society, or what kind of legacy I want to leave. And that usually means just like impacting lives. And no offense to other people, but I think it's kind of short sighted and somewhat meaningless to always live your life through the lens of career, because no one's going to really care about what email you sent or didn't send after you die, or like after you retire and you have your like retirement party. A lot of those people aren't going to be calling you, and no one's going to put up a statue outside of your corporate headquarters for you. And so you kind of give so much of your life for this thing that you've convinced yourself is meaningful. It's things like the book. That is what I more live for. And I've had people reach out to me on LinkedIn. I've had people email me. I've had people stop me in the street, and they tell me how much it has affected them and impacted them for the better and what it means to them. That's the kind of feedback that you want. If your mission is to impact and touch lives, my role going forward is pursuing more projects like this book, like the docu-short that I recently produced. And the book was an amazing opportunity. And it took about 2 years. It was a labor of love and trauma in some ways. Countless interviews, handing over dozens of documents, having to kind of relive these experiences in incredible detail. And it's taken a lot of thinking and reflection about what it means to be able to participate in a book written by a Kennedy, and having survived all of this that's happened to me and still have my education, still have my wits. I was so far gone that it wasn't clear like how I would recover. And now that I'm here, then I have the privilege of being a guest on podcasts and speaking on stage. There is this pressure to kind of go back into that mode that I was in before, of doing the things that are expected of me and going back to New York and like being more visible and vocal. And so I'm having to remember these lessons that I've learned of figure out what room you want to be in, figure out when you want to speak, and still choose an authentic path for yourself.
You mentioned the documentary short that you wrote and produced called The Wildest Pearl. It aired recently on New York City Public Television. It's available on YouTube. What would you say is the biggest misconception or the least understood aspect of mental health?
Two things. One is how common it is, in terms of a lot of people have diagnoses, and then people who don't have diagnoses can still experience anxiety and depression.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of our media and the celebrities that talk about mental health, it does skew more towards anxiety, depression, and not necessarily schizophrenia and bipolar. But my point is that it's very common. But at the same time, despite how common it is, it's also very difficult to sometimes get help, even if you want it, just in terms of the availability of resources. I think the video and the book are radical acts of trying to break that cycle of stigma. I guess the misconception is that you can't talk about it, is that you can't explicitly say that you have bipolar disorder, that these things have happened to you. And that's one of the reasons why I participated in the book in the first place, because I wanted to show that this person that has all the reason and incentives not to go public with his story, because he has a lot to lose, quote unquote, because I had built up this pedigree for myself. I wanted to show that I was willing to make the radical choice of being completely transparent. Even though I had a lot to lose, I'm going to be radically transparent, and then let's see what actually happens. Let's see if, I lose out on jobs. Let's see if I lose friends. And I didn't. I've been given opportunities because of how transparent I was. I've been given more respect rather than less because of my authenticity and openness. And so between the book and the video, I want to kind of demonstrate and lead by example that there is so much ground we can cover if we actually just had an honest conversation, and everyone loses if we stay silent. Our collective silence means that the system is not aware of the true demand of services. Employers aren't aware of the true impact of workplace culture on the individual well-being of their employees. Schools aren't aware of the mental health concerns of their students. And culturally, it just makes invisible a lot of people.
I never really thought about it this way, but you mentioned, we talk about people who have cancer, and that's much more accepted versus, mental health and someone saying, well, I was just diagnosed with this and I'm kind of going through it. You rarely hear those kinds of diagnoses being talked about so readily and so freely. So Justin, last question for you. You have 1 minute with someone who is stuck and they want to break out. What would you tell them?
I would have to advocate for talking to someone. Going back to our last few statements and being open and vulnerable, I think you should also be open and vulnerable about your limitations and how much you can do on your own. I always, especially when I'm speaking to men, because men talking about their mental health is its own issue, I describe it as, tell me the last time you tried to bench press 200 pounds by yourself without a spotter. That's not acceptable behavior in the gym. Like, you always have a spotter. If you're me and you're trying to achieve a very lofty goal, or you're ambitious, or that there's some hurdle on the horizon, why would you do that alone? Be proactive about your mental health rather than just reactive. And that's an indictment on the entire American mental health system, is that, we react to crises rather than preventing them. I have this book out about how, it ended on a good note. There's this pressure to stay good. And so I get worried about, am I fine? Am I kind of relapsing, if you will, not necessarily in terms of bipolar disorder, but in terms of just feeling okay about myself in this world and my mental health. And so I think having people to remind you, like, yes, you're fine, or to actually call you out on, no, you're not doing fine here, is important.
Kelly, you mentioned that we talk about cancer, but there was a time where you didn't talk about cancer. And they said they have the C. Like, they didn't even say the word. And so we have eventually changed that to there's races and there's ribbons and all this. And so, Justin, I feel like you're a part of this change for mental health as well. So thank you so much, Justin, for sharing your story.
Thank you for having me.
That was the resilient and triumphant Justin Maffett. And this is The Breakout.
Kelly and I are in the business of breaking free, being brave, and living boldly. We're here to inspire you to be the badass you are meant to be. Coaching and consulting is kind of our thing, and we're really good at it. Connect with us at abrachigroup.com.
And don't forget to subscribe to The Breakout so you never miss a new episode. Make sure you're following us on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. And please leave us a review. Reviews help more people find the show, connect with us, and live a more authentic life. I'm Kelly Gunther.
And I'm Dr. Carrie Ulrich. See you next time.